Hello and welcome to episode 197 of the Rollo and Slappy Show. Today is May 4th, 2020. I am Rollo McFlugel, and with me as always is Slappy Jones 2. Show notes page for this episode will be mcflugel.com/197, where you can find a link to our sponsor, libertymugs.com, where you can buy awesome libertarian and Bitcoin themed mugs and t-shirts and some other little knickknacks in there. And you'll also be able to check out our guest, who Slappy's going to introduce right now.
Yeah, our guest today can be found on Twitter at Zero Knowledge Actor. Zero Knowledge Actor is a Catholic, a Bitcoiner, and currently a medical resident. And today we're going to be talking about Bitcoin and Catholicism. So, Rollo, well, first of all, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
Absolutely. So, Zero, before we get too deep into kind of the meat of what we're talking about, or this might lead us right into the meat of it, do you want to give us a little bit of background on your Catholicism and Bitcoin? We're outspoken. This isn't a Catholic podcast; it's a libertarian podcast, and I'm trying to make it like more of a Bitcoin podcast. But we're outspoken Catholics here, and we've had an episode.
We don't hide it,
yeah, we've had an episode a couple months ago about squaring up being a libertarian and a Christian, in our case, Catholics. It had some mixed reviews, some very positive and some very negative ones. But curious to know, like, with your background, since we're gonna talk about obviously Catholicism and Bitcoin, because I think the two kind of fit very well together. But do you want to tell us a little bit about where you come from those areas?
Yeah, so we can go politics that'll lead into Bitcoin, and then the Catholicism. So from a political perspective, I was a little bit weird as a kid. Like, I was like into, because like there'd be these dinner table conversations at parties between like kind of the men, dad with all these kind of uncles, and my dad, kind of Rush Limbaugh, Michael Savage type conservative. That's kind of, I was like into those political conversations, and I didn't become like a conservative initially, but I remember like actually being a very big government person, because like, as a kid you'd read about like World War II or the space race, right? And be like, well, this is amazing. Like, when governments and like people get together, they can do these amazing things. I mean, ignore the fact that like the space race was kind of like a dick measuring competition between two terrible superpowers, and that World War II was a mass murder conducted by states. I was a kid. I was dumb.
We're all there. I'm right there with you thinking that stuff.
But I mean, I even remember, I think I was talking to my cousin, who's kind of one of these, I would argue, the worst type of leftist. And by this, I mean someone who like quotes Marx without ever reading Marx, like one of those types, very like intersectional type, who I remember being in a conversation with her when I was like 9 or something like that, saying like, the NFL has all this money and there are all these poor people. I don't know why the government doesn't just take the money from the NFL and like give it to poor people. Like, I remember saying that and like not realizing how like terrible an idea that was. But then 9/11 kind of changed a lot of things. Like, you kind of wrapped yourself around, like I think everyone kind of wrapped themselves around the flag for the most part, unless you're like Scott Horton. And then, became kind of much more like pretty much a neocon. I believed all of the wars, like all the lies of the Iraq War, completely believed, like 100%. I believed that there were a WMD in Iraq. I believed in the airfields underneath the sand, if any of you guys remember that one. Just every single lie. Fought it hook, line, and sinker. And it wasn't the failures of foreign policy that actually got me to question like the whole paradigm. It was actually the 2008 financial crisis. Because none of it made sense with the kind of the Chicago school type economics that kind of goes with neoconservatism, with like Buckley or like Buckleyism or something like that. And like, you're just searching for answers. And in high school, we were also on like something called, in senior year, we were on something like called Fed Challenge, which is a competition where you actually act out as the Fed, during the economic situation. Now, after 2009, they stopped it from being based on real world events. We were the last year to do that. And I remember looking something up, where I looked up the Fed funds rate and the interest on reserves. And I realized that the Fed funds rate was actually less than the interest on reserves. So I was wondering, like, what the heck? Why wouldn't you just take the money from the overnight market, park it in reserves, and arbitrage it to like no end, and like recapitalize yourself that way? So there was a lunch with Bernanke on the second day of the competition. And I got my teammate to like ask him that question, and he went on a complete non sequitur. Like, completely acted as if he didn't like get this question at all. And I was like, what just happened? I was like, wait a minute, why? That wasn't an answer at all. This seems like a really big problem.
Yeah.
And then, you kind of just like get lost. And then in 2011, in college, I was taking a course, and Professor Rizzo, class was, I think, money, credit, and banking, actually, had assigned the use of knowledge in society. And I read that, and that was kind of the libertarian red pill. That was the thing that kind of got me on the path towards, kind of libertarianism in that regard. It also exposed me to a podcast called Econ Talk, because another optional assignment that he had was to listen to an episode with Arnold Kling on Fannie and Freddie Mac. And that really opened my eyes, because I'm like, no one ever taught me about this. No one's really talking about this in the media. Like, but this seems like absolutely huge that there were these two quasi-government organizations just creating like a situation where money was just massively being poured into housing. And like, this is a housing crisis where but nobody's talking about the government's complicity in causing this issue. So I ended up listening to Econ Talk a bunch, and I believe it was in 2013 when Gavin Andreessen, I think, was on an episode of Econ Talk, and that's when I first heard about Bitcoin. That was the first time. And at that point, I had read Human Action at that point. I hadn't read Rothbard or Hoppe yet. People like Peter Boettke and, Russ Roberts, I think actually on Econ Talk kind of spoke of their like dislike of Rothbard, which is funny because like they like Friedman, but Friedman was just like as much an iconoclast, and he's like, a socialist on money. In that was when like I kind of looked at Bitcoin. That was a little weird. I didn't understand it technically, and that's what kind of kept me away from Bitcoin for a while. But from an economic perspective, I'm like, this is exactly what I'm like this is it. Like, this makes so much sense.
So you had a pretty good, I guess reading Human Action would do that too. You had a pretty good idea of how money should function and how just flat out messed up it was. I guess even in high school,
I just didn't understand how Bitcoin could keep its promise in the protocol. Mm-hmm. Like, I didn't understand how you could, like, it's all great. Like, everything sounds great on its surface, but how do I know that the monetary policy won't change, essentially? How do I know? And, like, I'm really bad with computers. Like, I might just, like, when your favorite, like, solo act is, like, Frank Sinatra and your favorite band's Pink Floyd, you're a little bit behind the times. So it was a thing where you just kind of, like, followed it in the background for, like, 4 years, because I was like, I don't know if this, like, I want to believe in this thing. I really do. And like, I never looked at another coin. So like, I'm one of the weirdos when it comes to Bitcoin, because I didn't, most people, it seems, in Bitcoin get into the tech, and that's their gateway drug to Austrian economics. Whereas Austrian economics was more like the thing that made me think, oh, Bitcoin's awesome. And then I'm like, I gotta eventually like look at cryptography at some point and figure out how this thing like works at like some level, right? And then also just kind of putting you more towards maybe we have some options here in terms of like being a little bit more libertarian. And actually, as you kind of go along, and to get back to a point that you brought in with people not liking, your libertarian, or having mixed emotions about your libertarian episode, like one of the things that you'll learn really quick for anybody who isn't a libertarian who might become a libertarian is that term's pretty meaningless. It can mean absolutely anything. Someone who, if Bill Weld can call himself a libertarian, and Tom Woods can call himself a libertarian, right? Or Dave Smith. Well, David Smith's a moderate Republican, or like
He's
like
a Christian conservative or something.
Yeah,
Isn't he?
Christian. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Right. Or, if you can think of like Cody Wilson as someone who is like, libertarian or anarchist in that sense, like these are people who, like, if you're going to put them all in the same tent, what are you describing? There's nothing coherent there.
Right.
So I was probably kind of this Hayekian minarchist type. And then as time went along, you're just kind of like, really for 6 years since like, you start, you're kind of bouncing around the idea in your head of like, okay, if I believe it, you can't initiate physical violence against anybody. That's not ever right. How do I justify a state? And you're kind of like a cat with like a ball of yarn. You're just kind of like batting this, back and forth in your head for like 6 years. And then at some point you just have to realize like, you can't justify it. And at that point it became a question of, okay, now what do I call myself? Because there's so much, anarchist is such a loaded term. Anarchist is also a term that like, has a really broad tent, because you have left anarchists, you have, quote unquote right anarchists or individualist anarchists, market anarchists. It's another thing where it's like, it's a term that doesn't really have a clear, it's so heterogeneous in what people think about it, but it has worse connotations than libertarian, right? Whereas some traditional Catholic might look at the term libertarian and think, you mean like essentially thinks libertine, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Whereas you say anarchist to someone, they think you want to like, go in Ted Kaczynski style and blow something up.
It's funny.
Right?
I actually had to trick myself into becoming an anarchist.
Right.
Because when I first came across, I got into libertarianism. Not ironically, but interestingly, my red pill was The Road to Serfdom. So another Hayek piece. And I started reading more and getting into libertarianism, and I remember seeing, I think it was on Reddit, and seeing like these guys that called themselves anarchists. I'm like, well, wait, they're just like people like me, but just don't think that we should have any state. They're not trying to, throw Molotov cocktails around. And I remember like I couldn't disagree with anything they were saying, but I'm like, I can't be an anarchist. And so I thought I was so smart. I'd be like, all right, well, here's what I'll do. I want to push the Overton window over a little bit. So I'll make anarchist arguments, but I'm not going to be an anarchist. That's what I did until one day I was just like, wait, I actually believe this stuff. So I needed to pull a Jedi mind trick on myself.
Yeah, no. And like, it's interesting how you end up classifying yourself, right, in that regard, because, if you use the term anarcho-capitalist, then you have to deal with all the, the PR war of the term capitalism, right? Which that's always like, pain, because like I'm the type of guy who's just like going to point to, Theory of Socialism and Capitalism by Hoppe and say, this is how I define capitalism. This is how I define socialism. You take it or leave it. Right. That's not the common kind of view of that. A common kind of view of capitalism is that which I don't like.
Yeah, the stock market is capitalism.
Right, or the stock market is capitalism, or the stock market's the economy. I mean, like, ask someone what economics is, and they'll probably think it has to do with finance.
Oh yeah, you trade stocks, right?
Right, exactly. It's like, people tell you like, man, like, why is it always, economics with you when talking about how like people are acting in the world? I'm like, well, because economics is about
that's what economics is.
It's about how people purposely use scarce ends to accomplish means. So it's just like, anytime you can have that framework, there it goes.
Yep.
It's funny, even in libertarian and anarchist circles, it's very easy to not agree what capitalism and socialism are.
Yeah, well, I mean, with anarchism, especially because of the legacy of anarchism, right? Because anarchism initially was a leftist.
Right. Well, even I mean, in like the more anarcho-capitalist type circles, it's yeah, that's true. But like, I guess from the anarcho-capitalist type circles, like outside of the Austrian, like anarcho-capital, like the Hoppe, Rothbard, like kind of the rigorous, systematic kind of logic behind it. Like, I don't know, like David Friedman seems like a cool dude. He's cooler than his dad. But like, I don't know, kind of utilitarian arguments or consequentialist arguments for anarchy don't make much sense to me.
I don't think they're very convincing at all. So, in that regard. But like around 2017 or so, I kind of made the decision like, yeah, I'm just gonna like take on the term anarchist. And just, I'm going to go with that. And around that time was also, you know, if I'm getting my timeline right, was the New York Agreement and the user-activated soft fork. And that's when I thought, oh, wow, this thing really is bulletproof. I mean, it's probably not like that's not the right conclusion to take away from those things about Bitcoin, that it's bulletproof from those two events. But I'm like, that was a real attempt to try and change how things were, and it failed. And like from a kind of corporate, like you know, your worst case scenario where what if all the big players in Bitcoin decided to like change a protocol, which is like what your fear was. And I have no idea how this thing works. But then like once I saw it fail, I'm like, wait a minute, now I really need to be in this because this is it. This is it. Like I'm all in, but now I need to really learn what the heck I'd be doing with this, because I spent 4 years kind of like sitting on the sidelines and like going to medical school and college and things like that. And like realizing like, wait, so like, what's like private keys, public keys? What? And then like, where do I go to buy this stuff? And then like, how do I know where it is? Like, is it like my bank account? Like, do I just like keep it on, like, is it like on some website or something like that? And they're like, it was just so like the learning curve is so intimidating in the beginning. But you just kind of like truck through it. And like, fortunately there was like enough time in medical school to like just do that on the side for a while. And then like, I think during the winter break in like the lead up is like, you know, when in that huge kind of like surge, in the price is when like I did most of my kind of like, okay, I have to read all this stuff and figure this stuff out. And then like I had to look up like, wait, why are there all these like other coins out there? Why isn't like everyone behind Bitcoin? So I ended up having to look, and this is like the wrong way to do it. I wouldn't advise someone to look at it this way, but unless you want to protect yourself, is like, I viewed all these other coins as like, well, why do these coins suck compared to Bitcoin? And like, that was my mindset about altcoins from the beginning, is like, why won't these work? Because there can only be one money, and it doesn't make any sense that like, you know, if there was another alternative that was so superior that people would be absolutely jumping ship in mass from Bitcoin to that. So that was also another thing in like that December of 2017 I did, was a lot of altcoin reading that was, you know, useful at the time in terms of like getting your ideas like, okay, you just kind of knock the bowling pins down one by one for each altcoin, and then you just kind of like forget about it. I probably should have like written notes for like anybody who was like thinking about like, hey, what do you think about like, you know, Monero? And I'm like, look, just don't. And that's kind of where that went. And since then, like I'll admit, I'm not like some hardcore, like high level Bitcoin user in the sense like I do not build my own hardware. I do not have like a giant like 7 of 11 multi-sig setup. You know, or like I'm not like ever use the Glacier protocol, or just because of residency and, you know, me living in apartments, like, and not having access to a router, I've never tried to set up like a Lightning node or anything like that. So not in that sense. It's much more I'm just gonna like hodl until like essentially we hit hyper Bitcoinization, because to me, like, that's the only time that it's appropriate. So you know, in that sense, it's kind of like a barbell strategy of fiat and Bitcoin. That's pretty much it. So you have enough fiat so that you're never, ever in a situation where you have to liquidate any of your Bitcoin holdings. And as long as that's the case, then I'm good. With respect to the Catholicism, so the term is cradle Catholic for someone who is born a Catholic, for you non-Catholics out there. And I was a Novus Ordo Catholic, which is a Catholic who attended parishes that were compliant with the mass of Pope Paul VI. And it was always somewhat unsatisfying in my life. I never liked the lack of reverence in those masses. Priest cracking jokes, clapping, Eucharistic ministers, When we were living in one place, there was like a woman, like a lay woman, who would just do homilies from time to time, which was like, oh yeah. It was weird. Really weird. Things like that. Like, I never understood the handshake of peace. Like, it made no sense to me at all. But I just kind of like trudged along, kind of like ignorant of the fact that, like, like, I knew there was something before, and like Vatican II was a thing, but like I never really looked into it. And like, my catechesis was pretty poor, but I didn't recognize it at that time, in terms of Catholic morality, and Catholic teachings. But then what really changed it for me when I was in medical school was McCarrick. So when the McCarrick stuff came out, I was someone who thought that, after the sex scandals in like the early 2000s when they came out, like, oh, okay, like the church probably has like, this under wraps. Because like there was a time period where like there wasn't any big reporting or anything like that. And then this McCarrick stuff comes out and you're like, oh, wow, this was way, way worse. Because it's not only, it's not just the pedophilia and the pederasty, it's in the seminaries.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and at that point, it's just like, this is just, corrupt from top to bottom. And it, when you combine it with kind of like the irreverence of the Novus Ordo and like the rampant sin in the hierarchy, you wanted to search for something a little bit different. So where I was in medical school, I just kind of Googled, just on a whim, I just Googled Latin Mass near my area, and there was a Latin Mass society about 20 miles north of where I was in medical school. So I went. And I think I had actually gone to a Latin Mass like once before in my life. When I was like maybe 14 or 15, we were like traveling somewhere, and like, when you're at the hotel or something like that, and you get, you end up searching like local mass like in the area, and I'm like, oh, there's a Latin Mass. I was like, oh, that seems cool. Like, and my dad was like, yeah, well, let's go. And it was like in the lower chapel of some church, and it was like really, really tight. I don't know if it was like an SSPX thing or whatever, just like a random independent priest somewhere, and I can't remember where it was. But when I went to the one in medical school, I went in and I was like, it just blew me away. It was a low mass, so it wasn't a high mass, but it was still the solemnity, the silence, how everything was so concerted, right? There was no wasted time. There were no wasted words. There was no wasted space. Everything had a purpose, and it was all towards God, and it felt like home, really felt like home. And I remember leaving and driving back and kind of feeling angry because I had felt like I had been robbed of something that I never had, right? Like, this was the Mass of all the saints. There isn't a single saint who did not attend this Mass, right? Pretty much. And it was the crown jewel of the church. And to say that the crown jewel of the church should be suppressed, right? And this was, clearly by now, this was after Summorum Pontificum and all that. But, to say that, from 1969 to 2007, that it deserved to be suppressed is absolutely inane. And then, like, I went another time, then I got into a car accident, so no driving for me. But it turns out the Lyft rides were like cheaper than me even getting like 6 months of insurance with where I was, even if I didn't get into a car accident. So it was like, all right, I just need to lift my way through the rest of medical school. And then when I came to residency, it turns out there's a monastery about 3 miles north of where I am that offers a Latin Mass to the public daily. So I would go as often as I could there. And then there's a FSSP parish that a little bit farther out, you got to take the train to get to. But as I kind of kept reading and reading more because, I realized 27 years of catechesis meant nothing because I don't know anything. So like in the past 4 months or so, really, I've been trying to like kind of build up in terms of like actually understanding things, like, reading through the Bible, reading through Aquinas, reading through all these things that like I never really took the time to do before, and making up for lost time in that regard. And like kind of reading through like, old documents and like, finding like, your various, YouTube channels that are for Catholic stuff. So like, what Meaning of Catholic is pretty great. Taylor Marshall's really good. And What Catholics Believe, which is, an SSPV, Father Jenkins nowadays. They still have their old videos from back in the day, but currently it's just Father Jenkins who does those videos now. Just trying to like learn these things. And the more I kind of like came to the conclusion that like, I don't know if like I'm not gonna, the Novus Ordo to me now becomes like something that like I don't think I could attend. I think like to the point where I think it would be almost insulting to God to attend that as your kind of Sunday obligation. So you either go to, a rite that St. Pius V would have, approved, based on quo primum, or you have to like, eventually you just have to say that there's nothing available to you. And that God will be merciful. So still on this journey in terms of like figuring it out. I haven't gone the full like, set of a construct. So I'm not like Luke Dash or, I think, Giacomo Zucco is also, a set of a contest, used to be like a set agnostic. I'm kind of in that, realm. And what I'm talking about there is whether the See of Peter is actually occupied or not. That's a whole interesting discussion about things. But yeah, that's pretty much it in terms of the politics, Bitcoin, and Catholic kind of routes for me.
Yeah, I'm glad you talked about a lot of the Catholic stuff, because I don't think that a lot of people, even Catholics, I didn't even know about the more traditional Catholic stuff and the things that you're getting into until very recently. It was more like Tom Woods started talking about it, and a lot of the Bitcoiners like you and I, seeing Luke Dasher talking about his stuff, that it really was like, oh, there's like a whole nother part of Catholicism and it made sense, because I remember my grandfather used to be, how he talked about Vatican II. For those that aren't too aware of that, that's when a lot of these changes were made in the Catholic Church, like the Mass was said in the vernacular instead of Latin, and just he talked about it so critically of it, and I just never understood, like, well, why do you hate it so much? Doesn't make sense. But then as I start hearing people like you and others talk about it, it's like, oh yeah, now it's all kind of coming together. And I could see how he would feel very robbed of that, going in the opposite direction that you went, having that. And it also just kind of makes more sense to have it in Latin, because your Catholic means universal, and I think it's very powerful that you can all kind of speak the same language, and
it's the same language over time, which is another thing, right? So what can get really confusing. And like this actually matters in terms of like if you discuss like the nature of the sacraments, right? There's a form, there's a matter, and there's an intention. And when you change the sacraments that have been the same for decades, centuries, from a language that has not changed, right? We can say that the code's ossified, right? Right? We've right, the protocol's baked. Like there's no changing that. We know these sacraments work, right? We know that they confer the graces that they confer. Otherwise, you'd have to argue the Catholic Church hasn't been conferring graces for almost all of its history or something like that, which would be an inane thing to conclude. But when you translate that over, it's like if you took a protocol or like a computer programming, and I'm not the greatest in terms of that, but if you took something from one language to another and you hope everything translates over, right? Or in this case, you might take it from one language like Latin to English, but then what kind of English do you take it to? So like, you can see like a King James Bible, right? What meaning do you lose there? If you're taking from the Latin to the English, or do you take from the original Greek to the English? And then what level of English, and then if you're going to take a previous English translation, do you take the previous English and take it into a modern English context? You can see all the room for errors that can be made in translation and misinterpretations. And that became
very obvious a couple years ago when they changed a lot of the
responses
said in English masses. I guess probably.
And those were actually attempts those were actually attempts to make the translation truer to the Latin.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And the problem becomes, especially with the sacraments, like, it's not just actually that the sacraments are changed in language. They're actually changed. A lot of them are changed very substantially in the form or the formula. And then sometimes you have to worry about the casualness in which they, do the matter. That you have to worry about the legitimacy of the sacraments in some cases, particularly with confirmation, and for the ordination of bishops. The consecration of bishops. My apologies, I misspoke there. Bishops are consecrated, priests are ordained, for you non-Catholics out there, just to on that distinction. And that becomes a real problem. That becomes a real problem. So, that which has worked for all time, like, why change it? Why do that? And if the answer is empirical, if the question was, oh, it's because mass attendance was going down, and we won't be able to convert these people, blah blah. It's like, well, one, most people were converted when Latin was the language of the mass, right? So that argument goes out the door, right? Archbishop Lefebvre went into Africa and converted like tens of thousands of people with a Latin mass. These people never knew Latin in their lives, and that didn't seem to stop the people from converting. At the same time, mass attendance continues to plummet, right? Like, how many Novus Ordo Catholics go to mass? Like 10%, 15%? Like, it has been an absolute failure in every single regard. The only type of person who could argue that such a failure must be continued would have to be a government bureaucrat.
Nah, it's true. I never really thought it that way, but you're absolutely right. Like, why? Yeah. If the goal is to get more people in church and it's not working, then you're being absolutely insane to keep trudging along. And I do really dislike how the church has over the last, I guess, decades been trying to be like, oh, well, let's try to make it so that we make it so that people will like it, instead of like, this is what we do, and we feel like that will attract people to it. Like it's the same thing. I remember I'm a hockey fan. I remember with the NHL, like maybe it was like 10 years, 15 years ago, they started changing the rules and stuff to make it more exciting, to bring more people on, because not as many people were watching.
Well, it's also because the New Jersey Devils in the mid-90s destroyed the sport.
Yeah, they are the worst. But it was like, yeah, let's change it up, and it was like, I don't think it never worked. Like, hockey became a niche sport, like it was always a niche sport, but it went more into a niche. That stuff didn't change. All it did was make people say, like, oh, I think they should have these rule changes. And they would say, oh, it's the season's too long. Playoffs are too long. They need more goals. And then they make it so that there's more goals in the game. And those people that are complaining, there weren't enough goals, that was just their excuse. That never made them go back and start watching it again. It may be a silly example because we're talking about, watching sports compared to, your salvation, but maybe a better example, since this is what the episode is about, is talking about Bitcoin, where like just going back, you mentioned a little bit before about the block size debate and how so mmany people the people that weren't too involved in it, or just the people, kind of the masses that say, hey, let's have to make the block size bigger to make it easier on people, make it cheaper, faster. They threw, all this nonsense out there about it. And it's like, I'm so glad that the people on the soft fork side of things really held strong and won out, because it was that staying true to the protocol is what will help make this stand the trials of time and all these other attacks, where if they loosened it up in order to try to appease people, then it makes it more open to attack and lose its ability to fulfill its mission. So I think,
yeah, and one of the things that Bitcoin has going for it that the Catholic Church unfortunately has a fragility to is that, you can take a new protocol and enforce it upon the bishops, right, as the Pope, and suppress the old protocol. Whereas if someone wants to write a new protocol for Bitcoin and wants to, say, all right, join this protocol, we can just be like, nah,
Right.
we'll just still run the same version of Bitcoin Core. Or if we found or of whatever you're gonna end up running, you have to actually convince each individual instead of exerting power through the hierarchy from a top-down manner, which is why, if you really talk to kind of like a lot of the traditionalist folks, you'll hear a lot of talk about, kind of Freemason infiltration and things like that. And, you can read books like Taylor Marshall's book, Infiltration. And there are some more books, obviously, like, by, and stuff by like, hardcore setes on this stuff, who've been talking about this stuff since like, 1970, in terms of that. Because I mean, like I said, some of them don't even believe that there have been popes since Pope Pius the 12th. So, and conspiracies like, around like a Cardinal Giuseppe Series election and then non-election, things like that, that if you can, there's a head of the snake in the Catholic Church. Not to call the Catholic Church a snake, but there's a place to go in order to be able to exert great power over the entire nexus. But there really isn't that with Bitcoin, and that is something that needed to be proved to me, and I'm really happy that like it did. And that like nowadays, there's just the more and more it becomes ingrained into society, either in terms of like, like if you're a congressman and like your daughter has Bitcoin or your son has Bitcoin, are you going to send your daughter or your son to jail? Like if you have it yourself, right? Like you can't shut things down completely as easily as you would, because you're now, you have an economic stake in this thing. So, if they wanted to kill it, they should have killed it like in 2012, right? Or like in 2010. That could have been possible. But now, I mean, the only real points to hit, if you really wanted to cause a setback but not a destruction, would be like the exchanges. But that might actually be the healthiest thing for Bitcoin in the long run, if you have on-ramps and on-ramps that allow people that are actually truly decentralized and force people to kind of think that way. I highly recommend everyone, if you're going to buy Bitcoin, to buy it on BISC.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've recommended that too. Yeah, it's funny. This conversation's going a lot different than I had it in my head before, because it was more like, why should Catholics like Bitcoin? But I think this is really even more interesting than that. And I think we might get to that thing, but like, we study Bitcoin. We understand how we try to understand how the network works and what makes it strong. And, going through this, we look at the, all the ways it can be attacked. And so when someone presents an idea that we feel like would open up an avenue for Bitcoin to be attacked, then that's what we reject, and we try to take steps or remain acting in the same way we were, that would be resistant to those attacks that would ultimately destroy it. And if you look at the way the Catholic Church has been operating, like in order to destroy something that has been around for about 2,000 years, you do what they've been doing.
Yeah, so
to attack
essentially
it's like that, I don't know if I got through what was in my head with that, but it's like,
yeah, no, what you have to do is you have to hijack the protocol, and then in the beginning, at least, what you want to do is you want to have a hard fork that you claim is a soft fork.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So this is where we can get you end up getting into ideas of hermeneutic of continuity versus hermeneutic of rupture, because Vatican II was written, the documents in Vatican II, a lot of them were written inherently very vague by people who knew how they would be interpreted, because they'd be the ones interpreting it. It's like, if the government writes a law or a piece of legislation that's ambiguous, but they understand how the bureaucracy is going to interpret it. That way, oh, well, we're not saying that, this is what the legislation says, but they understand, like, that's how the bureaucracy is going to enforce it. Then there's like no legal challenge in that case, right? On the merits of the actual wording of the legislation itself, because you can just say like, well, it doesn't say that, right? So you can weaponize that ambiguity in a way where you can say, well, no, look, this is continuous with, teachings of the church for the past 1930 whatever years, right? But in reality, what you're trying to create is a hard fork. You're trying to create a break from that tradition. And what happens is that people like my grandparents on my dad's side, who were, Roman Catholics. My mom's family is Syro-Malabar Catholic. So that's like an Eastern rite, that St. Thomas actually, like, I doubt that, Christ was pierced. St. Thomas, went into India and converted a mess load of people. I always think of that as like his punishment for having doubted God, Jesus' resurrection was to be sent to India. But, that's a heck of a penance. So in terms of like my grandparents, then I asked my dad a couple weeks ago, I was like, what did they think? I was like, well, they just listened to the priest and the bishop. Like, the priest and the bishop said, this is the new mass. And they're like, okay. And if you're a good Catholic and you don't believe there's any malice, and if you don't really if you see it as a soft fork, if you don't see it as a hard fork, then you kind of go with it. And that's what 99.9% of Catholics pretty much did.
Yep.
And then you inculcate this thing, right, until people feel like this is the right thing to do. And then when you try to bring back, what many, not many, but what I think is rightly called true Catholicism, they think of it as like, arcane or, old-fashioned or exclusionist or whatever. It's really like, if it's a concerted effort, right? Like Taylor Marshall's book Infiltration would say it is one of the more brilliantly orchestrated sabotaging and like ruinings of an institution from the inside, probably ever. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's wild to think about. And man, this is like but my mind's racing now because it's putting things in place and together, and that I never thought of it before. So, it's amazing. It's amazing how so many things kind of coalesce so well together, or that you can take something that you think is completely different, like Bitcoin, the Catholic Church, and kind of put them side by side, and you see that they basically work the same way, like that. And the ways that you attack one is the same way you attack the other, or the same way you secure one is the same way you secure the other.
Right. So I mean, you can view belief systems, right? Belief systems, languages, like etc., like all in terms of protocols. Now, I'm not like, I'm not the guy to like go for like a linguistics breakdown or a computer programming breakdown and like how to get like really deep into this analogy. But you can view these things as sets of premises or and combinations and things like that create a protocol that can be compatible or incompatible with other, program, like, other protocols. So for example, right, like someone who is, a heretic or a sect, right, or is in schism is someone who's essentially hard forked, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Someone who is in communion with the Catholic Church, someone in communion with the Catholic Church is interesting, is if you consider them, depending on the timing, if you consider them like a side chain, or if you consider them like a soft fork. That's like an interesting question. I haven't really thought too deeply on that one. Just because the Eastern rites and things like that, what you would think about that. And I don't know what you would think about I don't think we have an analogy in the in crypto where there was like a Christian religion that was in schism and then brought back into communion with Catholicism. I don't know what that would look like in terms of cryptocurrency protocol. That would be pretty wild. It's like if someone hard forked, it's like if Bitcoin Cash just essentially like changed their protocol to be compatible with Bitcoin somehow. I don't know how that would work. To extend the metaphor.
Yeah. Unless they just destroy their UTXO set.
Yeah. But then you can kind of see like, you know, and this is like one of the interesting things about it is, if I'm just like off the top of my head, just think about it, like the Catholics who believe like, you know, that all people can be saved and whatever. These are like the people who are, you know, who believe like Bitcoin maximalism is toxic. Mm-hmm. Right. And you see that with, you know, how people in the Catholic Church will sometimes, you know, the non-trads will attack trads as they'll think that they're toxic in that sense. Right. They're too dogmatic, you know, they, you know, that was for an older time, you know, things have changed. You know, Catholicism is only about, you know, mercy. Everyone goes to heaven. Yada, 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 right? Like, oh, any coin, like, we're going to have a bunch of coins. We're going to have Joey coin and, you know, whatever Andreas said in one of his talks. I remember him using the term Joey coin.
Girl Scouts are going to have their own cryptocurrency.
Yeah. This system of, like, ridiculous barter.
And assuming perfect liquidity and saleability. Yeah. It's just absolutely insane.
Yeah, and it's like, I mean, like, it is kind of like funny, like thinking about it now, like how trads and Bitcoin maximalists often get characterized in similar fashions, in that sense from the outside. Now, I think there's a lot more infighting among trads than there is amongst Bitcoin maximalists, because among trads you have people who are not compatible with one another in that sense. So if you're like, you know, if you're a set of a contest, like a hardcore set of a contest, so like Luke, right? Luke will say that anybody who follows or thinks that Francis may be a pope is not a Catholic, because in his mind, based on his logic, if he believes that Pope Francis is an anti-pope, then if you follow Pope Francis, you're following an anti-pope, and that's a heretical thing to do.
Right. It's funny when looking at Luke's Twitter when he starts musing about religion, that it triggers people so much. Like it's unbelievable how poorly.
I remember American Hodl going hard after him, like really hard. Not like, I don't think they were like direct, like tweeting at him, but just tweeting about him. And I was like, jeez.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, he really does. It's pretty impressive, like the responses that he can muster. And I don't think he intends it. He's not a troll. He's not he's not Bitstein or not Malice out there trying to like provoke, you know, turn people into, you know,
religion tends to do that.
Huh?
It seems like whenever, like we were saying when we had our episode talking about libertarianism and Catholicism, it gets a crazy reaction. Whenever you talk about religion.
And yeah, and I mean the thing about Catholics in terms of like libertarianism, you know, especially the trads, right? Like they view libertarianism, they view liberalism as like kind of the thing that kind of killed Catholicism, right? They kind of long for the days of the papal states. They long for the days of, you know, this union of the church and the state, with the church higher above the state. And to them, libertarianism is a byproduct of the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment is everything that was wrong with the world.
Killed the church in their mind. Right.
You know, they take it back to like, you know, the French Revolution and, you know, all you know, French Revolution, the revolutions of like, you know, it was 1848, and, you know, the funny thing is though, is like, you know, when you read like Aquinas and you read like kind of like, you know, the traditional Catholic ideas on like just value and things like that, I mean, they kind of read a lot like the labor theory of value. And you're like it would be a lot of work to like take the time to like show like you got some problems here, because you can't really, if these kind of ideas of value are kind of the justification that Marx had to create Marxism, which you hate so much. Because like Marxism does not work at all if you don't have a labor theory of value or a cost theory of value. Actually, Marxism in particular doesn't work without a labor theory of value, but any cost theory of value is invalid. So that becomes like a real issue, like in terms of talking to them about, something like Bitcoin in the setting of, controlling the state, or, from our perspective, eliminating the state eventually. So it becomes like an interesting thing to talk to them about. But I think as Catholics, kind of see the state taking things away from them, especially, during this COVID, whatever you want to call it. You can call it a crisis, you can call it a hoax. I most certainly think it was an overreaction, and that was like also a logically inconsistent one, for a statist, because at first it was, oh, well, we can't, let's not do anything, masks don't matter, blah, 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 to a complete like flipped position on this. Now we need to lock everything down and yada, 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 where there's no consistency, there's no principles. They just kind of view it as, I think people are seeing it as very arbitrary, who are having these things taken away from them, and taking away the mass, taking away the sacraments. I think that'll open a lot of Catholics' eyes in terms of these governments aren't to be trusted. Like they really aren't. Now maybe they can tell themselves a story, just like a lot of people, right? Like, some people like, Kamel Foster, if like on the Fifth Column podcast, would be like, Trump elected might allow people to see the executive branch as being too powerful in principle. And the problem with that argument is they're going to see Trump and just be like, look, this guy's terrible, but he's going to like be gone. We just need to work on getting rid of him and getting the right guy in there. So I like to think that there's like a little bit more optimism in terms of like the red pilling of people towards the state because of what's going on with this, and the amount of spiritual damage essentially I think that's being caused by the bishops and the churches, and this Pope just kind of bowing to the altar of the state. But you never know. Like, you can't really trust that. And ultimately, like, people like us, I mean, it's great to convince other people, and like it's good to have those arguments because you want as many people on the side as you want, but you're not going to have an anti-fragile way to destroy the state if you are relying on people to, be all in on it, right? You need to be able to do it with them being able to follow their own incentives and get to that same point. So if people, like we all think, right, in terms of money being devalued, Catholic teaching is certainly against the debasement of currency, right? That is, you can read, for any Catholic or any non-Catholic out there, I highly recommend The Ethics of Money Production by Guido Hulsmann. Mm-hmm. Phenomenal book. And actually, for all the Catholics out there, I would actually just jump to I think it's like chapter 13. Like, I think it's something like the spiritual consequences of inflation or something to that effect. That's going to be the chapter for Catholics to read in terms of what are the consequences of the state's control of money on society, not just from an economic perspective, but from like a social perspective. We're talking the breakup of families, the need for two income earners in the household, the move towards consumerism, commercialism, all of those things that Catholics, real Catholics loathe about modernity, right? Modernity being the, what did Pope Pius say? Modernity, I think, is the synthesis of all heresies. That is the chapter for you.
Yeah, that book, along with the Bitcoin Standard, made Hoppe make so much more sense.
Oh, wow.
Because I read Democracy, the God That Failed before that, and it was good. I liked the book, but then that kind of really brought out what a lot of those points and fleshed them out to have a better understanding of what he meant with a lot of what he was saying.
I think the easier Hoppe read actually is to convince, if you're trying to red pill someone on the state overall, I would say that my go-tos are usually Anatomy of the State by Murray Rothbard. Mm-hmm. And then the essay that I read in The Ethics of Economics and Private Property, Rothbardian Ethics, that Hoppe writes. Rothbardian Ethics, it's short. So, the problem with Hoppe is that the argumentation ethics is a lot to digest.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot to digest. But it's the one that I think default to in terms of the justification of private property, because it's the most logically sound. Because even like, kind of the more natural law, Murray Rothbard type stuff, like I can see that kind of like falling on like some deaf ears with that one, because they can just be like, well, I just have a different set of values. But if you kind of prove it like through argumentation ethics that like, no, you're going to have to like essentially perform a performative contradiction to have any other conclusion than this one. I think that's a little bit more powerful. Now you're definitely going to get people, I've had like, family members that are like, I just don't want to think like that. And at that point, you just know that that person's just an NPC for life. And there's nothing to do about that person. But at the end of the day, that's not what you need, right? You need to convince anybody that you can. And I think Rothbardian ethics allows you to see a great example of what private property means, because Catholics also believe in private property, right? You read catechisms, you read the works of popes, maybe other than Francis. Again, you read kind of like the great theologians. Catholicism is a natural law tradition. It's a private property tradition. It just, unfortunately, Catholic theologians never came up with a cogent theory of the state as it is in reality, right? There is this, and this is what that's the biggest stumbling block with Catholics when it comes to this. So if you combine like kind of Rothbard, Hoppe with Catholic theology, like I think they're completely compatible. I think they're absolutely completely compatible, because, whatever you want to use the term, non-aggression principle, libertarianism, whatever, it only tells you that which you should not do, right? Which is a lot of what natural law theory is, right? It's just that which you should not do. That does not conflict with what Catholicism, what God calls upon you to do as an individual, right? In a positive sense, right? Mm-hmm. What you owe to God, right, is not incompatible with the non-aggression principle. It's actually completely compatible. And that's the failure of, and like admittedly, that was the failure of pretty much everybody, right? Like who was really questioning the validity of the state until the 1800s, right? With like, in America, like Tucker and Spooner, and then like, Emma Goldman later, like in the early 1900s, and then you have like Proudhon and those guys in like Europe, and then like who really put it together, right? Like Rothbard, and that wasn't until, what was Man Economy in, say, like the 1950s, right? Like,
yeah, 50s or 60s.
Yeah, like, and like Ethics of Liberty is like 70s, 80s, like 82 maybe. Like, we went a long time without that, and that's the kind of synthesis that needs to be done. And like, I remember, I think some like, there were some Catholics who were like, because I think I responded to something on like, Eric Salmon's Twitter. Eric Salmon's another kind of like traditional Catholic who Luke would say isn't a Catholic, and actually I think tweeted at me once that he isn't a Catholic, who's actually into Bitcoin.
I think I saw that when you tweeted that, and at Luke, and he's not even a Catholic.
And I was like, that's very, that like I was taken aback for a second. I'm like, nah, that makes sense. That is something Luke would say, because someone like Salmons is one of these. He's one of those trads who says that the Novus Ordo is licit, but likely like impious, which is like, and like, believes Francis is the Pope legitimately, and like, yeah, for Luke, that's just like a no-go. Like, no way.
Yeah, because I remember clicking around on this guy, and I'm like, oh, he seems pretty good to me.
Seems like a Catholic, right?
It's like, it's tough to fake that.
I mean, I don't think I'd ever have this conversation with Luke, but getting to the idea of like the consecration of bishops, I don't know if he's a stay-at-home Catholic. So some of these guys who are set of a contest are so, their position is so, I'm not going to say it's extreme, but their logic leads them to conclude in like consistently in their own logic that there are pretty much no valid bishops left.
Right. Yeah. Right? I mean, it's not something that I obviously I don't agree with it, but I also haven't explored it to that point. But like, I understand, I understand where he's coming from. I understand his logic. And
I don't know, I can't remember if he's also like into any of the conclavist popes, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. But like, yeah, like yeah, it can become pretty fierce. Like I haven't seen, like, just kind of like my forays into trad Catholic Twitter in like the past 3 months. I'm like, this is like way more toxic than any kind of like Bitcoin maximalist toxicity that like people complain about, which is, I like obviously think is nonsense. But the reasoning behind the attitudes, both in terms of how Bitcoin maximalists react and how these trads react, is the same, right? Because the protocol is way too important to adhere to and to protect, right? Because you can't be wrong about this stuff. Being wrong is fatal, right? It's not like, oh, you know what? I like the Yankees, and like it sucks that you like the Red Sox, and you're probably an inferior person for that, but that's okay.
Right. Yeah. So I want to go back when you were talking about the Ethics of Money Production, and that is an absolutely fantastic book. I love that. But another one that you might, the book I read after that, because it was referenced so much in that Holzman book, was De Moneta by Nicholas Oresme.
Oh, by Oresme.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is it's a short read. And if you want, at least the book I had, it was Latin on the left and the English translation on the right, so you could read it in the in the church's language. But that's, I mean, he wrote that in the 14th century.
Yeah.
And
yeah, so Oresme would be also a great read, like, for a Catholic, in terms of money, because that's kind of the thing. Like, he's the dude, right? In terms of currency debasement, in terms of legal tender, et cetera, et cetera.
He makes he puts it so clear what the purpose of money is and what it is, and then you compare it to what we have now, or even like, have it from what they went, because he was writing for the problems at the time, so obviously they were debasing and clipping and doing all sorts of stuff, and he was saying like, this is like just over the top, sinful and horrible, and just absolutely unconscionable. And then you look at where we are today, and you just see how so far out of whack we are.
Yeah, and the nice thing about Oresme is that it is easily readable, in the sense that, like, if I wanted to get someone to read like Hoppe's kind of view on private property, I might like start them off on Anatomy of the State, then might like, get them on like a little bit of like, here's what actually in Rothbardian Ethics, like I think he actually goes through Rothbard's position on private property, but like you kind of ease them up into Hoppe. Whereas like I don't need to like give someone what has the government done to our money before like I give them a resume. I can kind of like give them that, because you're right, it is really easy to read in that perspective.
Well, fortunately, like everyone can remember, or not remember obviously, but think about like what it was like to use gold coins as your currency and your money. And so when you can think in that framework, and all right, yeah, gold was money, and so they used it in as their day-to-day medium of exchange. And then when you see how he's talking about like the things that you do to that for the prince to do for his own advantage, and now that harms literally everybody else, it simplifies it and puts it in a way that's just it's beautiful. It's such a beautiful read. I love it.
Yep. And then the one thing though then that you would have to do, because there hasn't been like a version 2.0 necessarily on the ethics of money production, which I actually, look, this might be sacrilege, but I do enjoy the ethics of money production a bit more than the Bitcoin standard in terms of like its history of money kind of analysis. But you would need to like, because I could see a Catholic end up becoming like a gold bug.
Sure.
And then you have to get into like the, kind of the Nick Szabo kind of stuff there, which I mean, that might be the lead in, right? Like this might be the progression that you take someone on, in terms of that is you kind of show them, a resume, and then you kind of have to show them, okay, so like, see where they think about that. And if they think like, oh yeah, so we just need to go to a commodity money standard. And then you got to kind of show them that like, sure, but then you have to have them at least think of the question, like, well, why did gold fail? Because if we had gold, like, why did it fail?
Going back to things that trigger people, especially in the libertarian world, when you say that gold failed, people get up in arms about that.
But
Well,
I don't
people-
know why you can argue otherwise.
So your argument, all right, I'm gonna try and make one up on the fly. Your argument could be that there was arguably two black swan events, or we could call it one black swan event. The Great War with an interregnum of or peace, right? With World War I and World War II, that were something so massive that the world had never seen, that led to, the United States getting to a Bretton Woods system. Well, World War I leading to kind of the craziness of that period, leading to, the massive recessions, and then the rise of Germany. Then you have, World War II, and then the Bretton Woods system coming up as a byproduct of the consequences of World War II. And then you setting yourself down the path, and then Stalin or the USSR and the USA kind of at loggerheads with one another, and that if you never have World War I or if you never have World War II, that would have then gold would have just been trucking along just fine. They could argue that it took two wars that have never. This is a very Steven Pinker, really dumb argument, but right, in terms of violence. But the problem with that argument, I'm just gonna break it right now, is that things happen that you can't foresee, right? So if the system is fragile to government takeover in a crisis, well, we're having a crisis of Leviathan right now, not a crisis of COVID, a crisis of Leviathan right now. So if you think the government doesn't have needs two world wars to just tap up gold, that's not the case. If anything, states are even more adept at seizing gold. What was it can't remember when it was, maybe it was I can't remember when it was last year, but I think Zero Hedge had that article, RIP Zero Hedge, who about Venezuela trying to repatriate their gold from the Bank of England. And the United States just saying nah, not gonna happen, and they couldn't. And if you want to show someone the problems with gold right there, it's right there, right? A nation state could nation states which live in a state of anarchy with one another, right? As Kuzan writes in I think Do We Ever Escape Anarchy or something to that effect, or Do We Ever Leave Anarchy? Great paper. It's 8 pages. It's really short. Very good at the logical question, actually, that a nation state can't get its gold back. Well, what chance do you have if if the government decides wherever you're holding your gold, oh no, it's ours now, or nope, you cannot withdraw your gold. What are you gonna do? You're gonna do nothing. You're gonna do a grant. You're gonna do nothing. Now, that's when you're going to get into the question. Then the next step, I guess, in the logical train would be well, what if I own the gold myself? And then that's where essentially you'd have a discussion on a gold full node versus a Bitcoin full node in terms of operation costs and things like that.
Yeah, one's a little bit easier to run.
Admittedly, though, one of the things that's going to be that I don't see happening is I don't see a lot of, Bitcoin Tina aside, and a few exceptions, I don't see the boomer generation really figuring this out.
Right.
And that means they're going to get trucked in the next 10 years, 15 years, because this is the group that's, built on fixed income or, fixed incomes, going forward, that are going to be totally eviscerated. Though, the complex argument is that the United States, because it has a reserve currency and there's a pretty bad dollar shortage in the world because of the breakdown of euro dollar markets, the U.S. could pump for a while. But assuming that they might not be able to, or oil crashes to the point where the petrodollar's hegemony is actually on shaky ground, that becomes a real issue. And Peter McCormick on the What Bitcoin Did podcast talks about this a lot, is that if we're talking about mass adoption, if we're talking about people getting their figuring it out, there needs to be a lot more improvements in terms of the ease of use combined with optionality, so that if you want to ramp up your ability, like to be self-sovereign, that you could theoretically do it like with a user interface, like with a similar enough interface where you're not like flipping through wallets and like trying to be like, well, I could use this wallet or that wallet. Unfortunately, like people just, and it's like politics, right? Like people should not be having to spend so much time on that, right? Like it gets to your, like, you know, you had that question, I think you had that tweet about self-sufficiency, and it's like self-sufficiency is great in an adversarial system, but if you're constantly in an adversarial system where you can not trust anybody and you can't, you know, have a division of labor for that reason, then like you end up becoming pretty poor in that regard. So there needs to be some degree of ability for people to use Bitcoin, maybe not as hardcore, not as self-sovereign, that's not going to tank the network. And I am not the person to figure out that problem, where that balance lies. I have no clue.
I've gained an appreciation listening to some of the more hardcore Bitcoin podcasts. Like I was listening to Citizen Bitcoin today with the Matt Odell episode, and talking about, because Matt's real big on privacy, and you know, going into the weeds about just even UTXO selection, which is something that the average person in Bitcoin probably never even heard of that term. I say average very loosely. There's, you know, the hardcore maximalists, they probably all know what that is, but just more the not the average, but the more casual Bitcoin user has no idea about what that is. But that can cause, and there's so many little situations like that and little nuances in it that could cause a lot of security threats for your own personal privacy, where it's like, and then you start to see like, all right, well, this is why we'll just make it easier to use. It's like, well, yes, all these programmers and developers out there understand, and that's what their goal is. They're trying to make it easier to use, but they can't do it in a way. They have to do it in a way that they're not going to sacrifice the security and the privacy for the convenience. So,
right. Otherwise you get the Novus Ordo Church of Bitcoin, right? Like, you know, you
exactly.
get and that's not what you want.
Right.
Right.
And so I think that a lot of people get frustrated with Bitcoin, like, well, I want to kind of use it right now and blah, blah, you know, all this stuff. And it's like, because they don't look at Bitcoin in this depth to know. It's not a criticism of them. It's a lot. Like you have to use a lot of time and energy to go into all this stuff. But I just wish that people who are a little bit impatient understand everything that's what's going on, especially when there's all these altcoins out there that promise all these, you know, quote, improvements, unquote, where they just completely ignore, if they're even aware of it. They could be lying about whether that these things aren't a problem, or they're just not even aware of it. We have these privacy things, and it's fast, and we can, you know, without telling you all the downsides. And so people are like, well, why can't Bitcoin be like that? You say Bitcoin's so great, but it's so difficult to use. Sorry, that was kind of a ranting.
And then, you know, you get, you know, the occasional, you know, like, you know, Peter McCormick will talk about this. Ragnar will talk about this a lot, actually. He tweets about this a lot, right? Like, Bitcoin's terrible for poor people, and, you know, it doesn't work in third world countries, and like it's not usable now and things like that. It's like, look, at the end of the day, people are going to, Bitcoin has to be Bitcoin, and people have to figure out how Bitcoin can help, how they can use Bitcoin, right? Just like, you know, what's the line? I can't remember whose line this is, right? Like, you don't change Bitcoin, Bitcoin changes you. Mm-hmm. And I would hope, like, you know, you alluded to earlier, that the Catholic Church took more of that stance, right? That you don't change the Catholic Church, right? This is the church laid down by Christ. Catholic Church changes you. You conform to Catholicism, to the will of Christ. That happens, and that in the grand scheme of things, like play the, like, I know people are impatient, but play the long game, because, you know, people like us, right, who are like, let's go with this Novus Ordo Catholic thing, right? Don't despair, Catholics, because what's going to happen is, like, I mean, depending on this survey about the traditional mass and where Pope Francis is trying to maybe ban it again, gosh, but if you look at traditional Latin mass parishes, they're crying. There are a lot more babies crying in that parish, and one of Taylor Marshall's lines is, "If your parish isn't crying, it's dying." And who goes to Novus Ordo churches? Right, older people, boomers. Right. What's the platonic ideal of the Novus Ordo family? It's like 2 parents, 1 or 2 children. Right. So like they're even at best. And that's assuming that the kid's even going to stay Catholic. And that might be like a 40% chance. So
I'm
like,
shocked if it's that high.
Yeah. Right. Whereas, these trads, they get married super young. They have like 8 or 9 kids. And like these people like actually like really care about, like, there's no, like in my family, though, being, I think that comes with, my parents coming from India, is like, they'll beat the crap out of you if you decide to like, leave the Catholic Church. So you have much more, like, if you can see over time, kind of the generations churning over, right? And like 2-3 generations down the line, you can see that like that element in the Catholic Church, or the Catholic Church, depending on how you want to define it, grows at an exponential rate, whereas the Novus Ordo stuff kind of stalls out or falls like, Japan's population.
Right.
Right. And the same thing is with Bitcoin. Like, we are the people, right? Just like we were late to Bitcoin in our lives, right? Because we're in 20s, 30s, 40s, whatever, right? Just like, I was late to like recognize, like, after 27 plus years or something like that, like, oh yeah, I kind of don't know anything about my Catholicism. So you try and catch up now. Well, you might not be the person who ultimately benefits from, turning to like finding the true Catholic faith. But what you're going to be able to do is you're going to be able to give your kids, from the moment they're born, the opportunity to truly understand it way better than you did, because they won't have a 27-year wait to start figuring things out. Where you see kids nowadays, like if you have kids who are 8 or 10 years old, and like they're figuring out stuff with computers, they're kind of like learning about Bitcoin. They're especially with the COVID crisis, they have plenty of free time. They can put on 10 hours of Bitcoin instead of doing their dumb public school assignments or whatever, their Zoom conferences or whatever like that. Mute that, put on some JW Weatherman, and learn this stuff. Now you have a group that going forward is gonna like I don't know what the generations are now, like Z or something like that. Like those are the people who are going to be essentially, the more familiar with it, the more it's like just kind of a thing in their lives, the more natural it is to them. It doesn't become like an issue then as much for adoption, right? In terms of how easy do we need to make this? How much do we need to sacrifice things? You're not trying to appeal to a boomer. You're trying to appeal to someone who's grown up with computers, who, if you give them experience at a young enough age, like they're going to figure it out because they'll have time to. Whereas a boomer who's like 60, 70 years old, like they're going to live for like 10, 20 more years. What do they care to learn in terms of like something new? Whereas to a child, everything is new. There's always an opportunity to learn. And, something like, even like MathBot or something like that, like that's a really cool way to like get kids to learn math and programming and to make them really much more like understanding of like how to operate in like a Bitcoin world, which is pretty dope.
Yeah, it's I love the way you put that, because I was thinking when you're saying like, well, your kids have an opportunity to kind of start at their birth and their baptism to really in a better way of understanding their faith, and they're like, well, yeah, and you can stack sats for them too. Get them a head start there, because it's like right now I don't know when hyper Bitcoinization is going to happen, but hopefully I have kids I can pass those Bitcoins on to, and I think
I'll put my flag down. So my line was, I think by 2050 Bitcoin wins, but with the like with kind of that was under the assumption that there'd be a recession in the next 1 or 2 years, and then they'd get themselves out of that one, and then they'd be out of ammo. It seems like that timetable kind of accelerated quite a bit because they caused themselves a recession that really, like, financial tools aren't really going to get you out of, because you're trying to use your financial tools to essentially prop up a structure of production that makes no sense with consumer preferences. But if you have no structure, if you just shut down the structure of production, you can't pump money into that to, like, fix that. It's just like, I mean, you can't pump money, period, but you're not even going to get your, like, government, like, sanctioned metrics to, like, look good just by pumping money into an economy, because it's not that you're trying to preserve a current structure of production. You shut it down.
Yeah, it's... I mean, 6 months, if someone told you what we would be in the midst of 6 months ago, you would have laughed at them. Even those of us who have very poor views of the government and what they do and how awful the Fed is, and I can't believe how much money they're printing and all this stuff. It's just...
All I'm saying is zero hedge is right, and that was about 6 months ago.
Yeah. So, when I was thinking about this episode just a few hours ago about what to talk about, the first reading from Mass on Sunday popped into my head, and I've been watching since I can't go to Mass on Sundays now, we're watching the Bishop Barron Masses.
Okay.
Sorry, I got it. Oh, never mind. And something from his homily kind of stuck out from the first reading, and I'll read the verse. It's from Acts chapter 2, verse 37, and I want to just hear what your reaction, in the context of everything we've been talking about, just what your reaction is. So here it is. Hearing this, they were cut to the heart and said to Peter and the other apostles, "What are we to do, brothers?"
So, I mean, when it comes to that, you know, I have to recall the overall context with respect to that. In terms of what preceded it, as it's always hard to kind of...
So Peter was giving a sermon to the men of Judea and all you who live in Jerusalem. So what he said right before that, give you the first part of the reading because it's short. Then Peter stood up with the 11 and addressed them in a loud voice. Men of Judea and all you who live in Jerusalem, make no mistake about this, but listen carefully to what I say. For this reason, the whole house of Israel can be certain that the Lord and Christ whom God has made is this Jesus whom you crucified. And then hearing this, they were cut to the heart and said to Peter and the other apostles, "What are we to do, brothers?"
Yeah. And ultimately, with respect to like the Catholic thinking on that, right? Like is that the only thing to do in that case is to repent and to follow Christ.
Well, you know,
that's like
the next line was, "You must repent," Peter answered.
Right. Like that's the only answer there is. I mean, ultimately, right, from a Catholic theological perspective, and I can't speak, or I can only speak from a Catholic perspective, right? The agony in the garden, the suffering of Christ, you know, throughout, you know, his time on his way to Calvary is him literally. So, you know, if you die with mortal sin, you wind up in eternal hellfire. If you wind up with a soul without mortal sin, but is wounded by, you know, the stain of sins, right? You wind up in purgatory, and they run on the same furnace. So it's not like that's like a picnic purgatory. It's not like some train station where you're waiting for, you know, the next ride to heaven, like some, like, you know, like nonsensical show like The Good Place or something like that. Like it's quite bad. Jesus, in order to, like, you know, to save us, and to redeem us from all those sins, literally felt that pain for every single sin that was committed before and until the end of time. So our current sins are actually sins that Jesus has paid for, in pain. So, all of us are responsible, right? Because if we had never sinned, if Adam had never sinned, Jesus would have never had to do any of that. So we are all responsible, in that sense. So what are we to do? Well, the only thing we can do is repent and to do as God's law says, and to ask for the grace and the assistance we need to get to heaven. Because ultimately, the idea that you can get to heaven on your own is absolutely nonsensical. It makes no sense. To say that you can merit God's love, you can't merit, your finite capacities cannot merit something that is infinite. It doesn't make any sense. And that's just like the answer. You're going to fail. You're going to struggle a lot of the time. It's not going to be linear, right? But you have to do it. And in the same way, if you really want to take down, the state, like you have to do what you have to do in that sense. And when it comes down to it, is like you got to get, like, you have to be in on Bitcoin, I think. Like you have to kind of be in on 3D printed weapons. And going a step farther, and I think this is another place where you can kind of appeal to Catholics from a Bitcoin perspective, is if you want to make the jump to Bitcoin allows for localism, and that anarchy is anarchy would lead to many more localist societies, that's where you're going to form communities around kind of true common bonds of trust. So, we were talking about, right? You were saying, right? Like, self-sufficiency sucks, right? But you need that in an adversarial system to some degree because you can't trust people. Well, then the solution is you need to form communities in which you can trust people. And ultimately, those are going to be built on blood relations, right? And that they're going to probably be built around faith. Those are your two big ones. Mm-hmm. And I think that I would argue that's how society would line up. And if I'm going to tell a Catholic, this is why you need to be into Bitcoin, I would argue this is the way you can form a community or lead to the creation of communities that are really around God. Because if you think about it, if we hit it big with Bitcoin, there's a lot of places in the world, Montana, South Dakota, or if asset prices crash anywhere, potentially in the United States, to set up not really a citadel for yourself, but to set up a community of like-minded individuals where you buy this land and you turn it into your own. Mm-hmm. And you turn it into a community that looks out for one another, that can center their lives around Christ, because there's no exterior distractions or temptations, right? Like, if you're a Catholic, you want to be in a community where, like, I can drop my kids off at, like, I can have, the neighbor watch my kids, and I don't have to worry about what's going to be on television in that house, right? Or what they're going to see on a computer, or, that they're not going to say the rosary if, they have to stay there overnight or something like that, right? There's a real peace of mind there. Or that, I can keep the Sabbath holy because I'm in a community that doesn't tempt any of us to end up having to work on Sunday. And we can actually spend time, kind of in prayer and, in recreation with our families. So, you have to you can couch it that way, in the sense that if you want to form the communities, if you want to build, a shining example of that, you need to be able to have that kind of localist kind of view, and that ability to not have to be chasing things all the time, to not have to chase, two incomes in the household, to not have to, to have land be so expensive that you can't even form these communities in the first place. And that ends up getting into it's an interesting thing as to how you would walk someone down this rabbit hole, because it's going to take some time, obviously. But hey, we're in it for the long game, right?
Yeah.
In terms of that. But the other thing is that, like, this is another way to kind of why Catholics should be definitely for Bitcoin is you look at the Vatican Bank, and the Vatican Bank is an absolute cesspool. Like, I don't believe money laundering is a crime. At the same time, the Catholic Church probably should not be having clients that they do. And like major financial loopholes. So like, I hate this movie with a passion because the first two movies are the two greatest movies of all time, and this third one is absolutely terrible. But the third one is inspired by like a real Vatican Bank scandal. In terms of like The Godfather Part 3.
Mm-hmm.
I thought you were going to say
that's where you were going.
I thought it was Return to the Thunderdome.
No, Godfather. Yeah, Godfather Part 3. There was that was actually based on a real Vatican Bank scandal. So if you wanted to, and this gets into a real interesting thing, because I don't know what TradCat's position is on fractional reserve banking, but the Vatican Bank is certainly a source of, it is how the hierarchy can stay fat and loaded, without having to serve people, right? Because, and this is where you get into the lesson of, the number one way to make money in the world is if you can have access to a printing press.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And if you can fractionally reserve with a bank, you are the printing press. You are your own printing press. And it is a beautiful thing to have for you, because seigniorage is about as sweet as it gets when it comes to having the ability to raise revenues without any value being produced. And if you're talking to people who think that there's a lot of corruption in the Vatican and believe that the Vatican Bank is, a terrible thing, or if you're talking even more hardcore, where like people who are like, we need to see the Novus Ordo collapse. Well, think about how indebted these parishes are, right? Now, one could argue that, okay, maybe an inflation would inflate their debts away, but the asset values of the land that they're on would also probably plummet quite a bit if they didn't have if the land didn't serve as a store of value. So if you really wanted, a cleansing, a purging of the Catholic Church from hierarchy top down, it's like you have to get these bishops, these cardinals, and these popes focused on the ground, like focused on the flock, and not all the excesses of the power and the the power and the influence that having a bank can have, that being involved in politics can have, right? Like Francis is talking about climate change, like this kind of secularist, these are the kind of things, right? You can't serve God and mammon. You should not have a Vatican Bank in that sense. Like the Vatican should be the Vatican should always run full reserve, like 100% of the time. Like there is no institution on this earth that should not, like, has less of an excuse to like not run like full reserve. Like they're completely, but these are the things that you have. So ultimately, you have to say that, like, humans are wounded, and you have to attack things at a fundamental level where you're not relying on them going beyond their wounded nature, right? Because that requires an acceptance of graces from God and a maintenance of that. But we all know that most people don't go to heaven. That's just like not true. Like, I think it was like St. John of Christendom or something like that, who said like that hell is paved with the skulls of bishops. So if we can't assume that most people will accept Jesus Christ into their hearts, because the way is the proper way is narrow, but the way that leads to damnation is wide and very, very attractive. Then you have to have tools in which individuals will do the quote unquote right thing, or won't at least do the wrong thing, because it would be way too painful for them on this earth to do that. And that's what Bitcoin does. And that's why, you know, Catholics kind of have to support Bitcoin unless they really want to trudge through life just complaining without doing. Because there is no way you're going to get back control and get back the influence of Christ in the lives of people without elimination of the state, which I would consider like a straight up false idol. You know, when you consider like we were talking about before the show, when you're pledging allegiance to a flag, right? Even if you're going to say under God, like people, that's lip service, right? The idea that, you know, like, do you think, you know, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, any of these people, that these people are constrained by God's law in their minds? Not at all. Not at all. They'll murder anyone. You know, they'll steal from anyone. They will break the commandments at will. So these are not people that, like, you know, that you can trust to be controlled. Like, it's just not going to happen. So ultimately, the Catholic argument for Bitcoin is as such: one, you have to destroy the greatest false idol that there is. Two, the consequences of inflation are what leads to kind of this social decay in society. Three, Bitcoin allows Catholics to form the communities and form the relationships I think that they want in order to bring up their children, most importantly, in the Catholic faith. And four, by destroying the capacity, theoretically, to fractionally reserve bank. I mean, I think you just get wiped out really easily. You end up really taking away one of the most corrupting forces, I think, in the Vatican and the hierarchy of the Church, in terms of the Vatican Bank, which I don't think anybody can argue that the Vatican Bank is, you know, a good thing. That'd be quite the argument to try to make. So that's kind of like where my head's at when it comes to that. But the underlying principles that would lead you to that conclusion that's the stuff that takes a lot more work, because you're going to have to red pill on quite a few elements there.
Yeah, that was a lot more than I was expecting to get from that passage, but that was great. I think you
it was excellent.
Yeah, and I think you summed up the Catholic case for Bitcoin at the end very well right there. Yeah, I really don't have much to add.
I was going to, yeah.
That was great. So, all right, let's try to jump into a free market success story. We were kind of talking about this before the show, and trying to come up.
And how many you see on a daily basis.
Yeah. Oh, actually, before I forget, because I just popped my phone up and I was pulling up. Did you happen to read the Sven Schneider's article, "Stop Calling for a Free Market and Money"?
No. What is this?
Yes, it's "Stop Calling for a Free Market and Money." Guy Swan on the Crypto Economy read this recently and gave a little talk on it. It sounds like the title sounds weird, but he makes the case because when we were talking about gold earlier, how gold failed, and it's like it's like in a normal thing. It's like, oh, if we had a free market, then we'd have all this stuff. I talk about like non-monetary stuff, but then with money, it's like, well, we can't say like, oh, government, you know, let us create our own little money free from your fettering and everything. You know, if your money can't stand up to the attacks that government's going to give you, like it doesn't matter. So it has to be something that you can't say like, oh, we need to set aside this little free market area for our money to work. It has to work despite the anti-market. It's got to break through. Be strong and robust enough to break through all of the attacks.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is just like, okay, I get what they're saying.
Yes.
Or what he's saying.
I remember
So,
I had the same reaction when I first read the title. I'm like, this doesn't, but someone retweeted it. I'm like, well, if this guy lied, maybe it is something good. I read it. I'm like, oh, this is excellent.
Yeah. So yeah, this is the idea that this is the idea that a free market, yeah, because you don't ask for a free market, right? Because if you have a state, right, then no one really there's no such thing as private property in reality, right? Because there is no overlying authority of the state, so therefore any private property or any property claims that you have or that any person has are really just conditional privileges of the state, because the state at any time can decide to seize your property, and if they can do it at any time without you having much of a recourse, then you really don't have rights to property, right? I always make the example. I always end up using this, and sometimes people will be like, "Well, that's absurd" or whatever. But like, I think it tends to get the message across. If I tax you at 100% of your income, you'd rightly call that slavery. So, what's the difference between 99, 98, 97, etc. on principle? On principle. Right. So you don't have a right to you don't have a right. Technically, you don't have a right to any of the property that you have as long as the state exists. So
it's all you
don't ask. Them. Right, you can't ask for a free market. I agree with that. I agree with that totally. And I think I've made this argument before, is that it's an interesting thing whether you want governments to be hostile or not hostile to Bitcoin. And there are good arguments on both sides. I think ultimately for Bitcoin to succeed, it shouldn't matter in either direction, to be honest, in reality. But the argument for governments being friendly to Bitcoin is you just want to ingrain that. It's like, you know what? I'll go with it. It's a virus, and you want the virus to spread as much as you can through the population, right? To the point where it's inserted itself into so many genomes, effectively, that there's like the genie's out of the bottle. Like, you could try to regulate this thing, it's over, right? From that perspective. That's one way of going about it. The Bitcoin being the hostility towards Bitcoin thing is the anti-fragile argument, is that your goal is to take down like nation states here. Like, you are going at the core of the livelihood of the greatest villains and criminals and moral degenerates on the planet. And if that's the case, this thing needs to be more than bulletproof. And that means this thing needs to be tested everywhere and anywhere, which means that any nation or any government that decides to ban Bitcoin ends up becoming a test case for how Bitcoin can route around it. And the better it gets at routing around it, the less worrisome any particular government's threat is. Now, like, I think the one threat that I haven't really like pieced together in my mind, other than like shutting off their water supply, is if like the NSA decided to like monitor every single packet of like like internet data and like started to like block various IP addresses and things like that. We'd still be running things over Tor and stuff like that. But
did you
unless you believe Tor has like an NSA backdoor.
Did you see that Blockstream today came out that now, you know how you can use their satellite to operate a full node? Well, now you can do the initial block download from their satellite.
Oh, really? How long does it take?
That's my question. It might. I imagine it might take a while, but that's a big, important step.
Well, so like this is like an interesting question about like the stages, right? In terms of getting to like a truly anarchist society, right? And like I have like this kind of like rough thing, right, as a pinned tweet of mine, and like if I ever read through the resource list, like I'll eventually try to write like while I'm in residency to try to write like a paths to anarchy, like how you would get there, because there are a lot of books justifying anarchy, but I find that like Austro-libertarians have done like a pretty poor job at actually detailing how that would be beyond we need to convince people that it's the right way to go, and that's just not going to work,
right?
Like at all.
Right.
It doesn't make any sense. But like you see that, right? Like Rothbard and Hoppe and like Hayek all talk about like, well, Hayek especially, right? Hayek's the one who's just like, we need to get the intellectuals on our side. And I'm like, that's just not good. You're not going to take the gravy train. You're not going to tell the intellectuals who rely on this gravy train to like argue against the gravy train. Right? It's just not going to happen. But right, if a government or if a state operates through theft in three forms: inflation, debt, so theft later, and confiscation now, so that's taxation. Bitcoin kind of deals with while the inflation, obviously, and if you can't inflate, you do have a higher risk of default, right? So it would make debt servicing much, much harder, right? Like, what, interest rates in, like, what, 2005, or like the 10-year treasury was like 5%? Imagine the 10-year treasury being 5% right now with 23 trill of debt. Like, that would be like 1.1-ish trillion in interest payments. Like, there's no way. There's no way. If we ever need to go to Volcker levels, it'd be cooked. Absolutely cooked. So when you take away the inflation, you actually really increase the default risk, which would increase the interest on debt. And, kind of in non-meat space, in cyberspace, if you can encrypt kind of the trend, like, communications and therefore, have transactions of Bitcoin network with no one knowing that who's transacting with whom. And, getting into like, coin joins, P2EP, like all sorts of, privacy stuff, Lightning itself, then you have like a real like interesting way to kind of make it hard to tax, because if you have plausible deniability, what are you going to do? Head tax everyone? Which is, I think, what ends up being like the conclusion in the sovereign individual, right? Is that people will be moving from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and like the best they can do is just head tax them.
Yeah, and that starts showing people what the state is. That's the really sneaky, horrible thing about the inflation is that you're a slave and they're stealing your value from you, and it's slow and you don't realize it. As soon as they start directly taxing you, then that's when there's going to be a pushback, and they're going to have to pull back on the size and scope of what they're doing, which allows the market to flourish more. There's more capital among individuals, and they're able to start producing more, coming up with better solutions for things, creating their own defenses.
So that's the difference. So the difference is, so Hoppe talks about this a lot, is that the worst states are usually the people that are the most from the countries that are most economically free. Because if we view the state as a parasite, the healthier the host, the healthier the parasite. Right. So what you need to do is you need to fundamentally change the trade-off between aggression and mutual exchange. Right? That's the fundamental trade-off we're working here, right? How are you going to obtain resources or property? Are you going to do it through mutual exchange, or are you going to do it through aggression, right? The initiation of physical violence against property. And in that case, Bitcoin really does, right, take away the value of doing it through inflation, doing it through taxation, doing it through debt. And also, obviously, your debt service, your risk of default also increases for a government if you can't tax very well. So all three of those get hit. But then we have to move into like meat space. And that's the next step, right? Because at that point, next things for government to tax would be property. Straight up, right? Like they would just tax the snot out of your property. Now, property taxes, like you were saying, if they're just taxing you 30-40% on your property, I think you might have some revolts. I'd hope. The United States used to be a country. There should be a place where you would tar and feather tax collectors, or you'd shoot them off your property. We need to kind of get back to that a little bit, potentially, maybe. And then the other thing would be that you have a lot of corporations who are going to be willing to play ball with the state because of their LLC status in particular, right? So, like, let's say you have private transactions, but at the end of the day, Walmart is willing to tell the government, here are all the people who shopped at my store, here's all the things that they bought, right? And if you have an economy where there's a lot of centralization, right, which is what we're heading towards as, the central banks just kind of print out a ton of money, there is a way for a private public partnership in order to elucidate who has at least spent what, so that you would essentially get like a pure consumption tax type of situation.
Coinbase.
Right?
Sorry. Excuse me.
So ultimately, yeah, like you would need to figure out how to like decentralize some of this to some degree. The question is like how much, because these states, it'd be really different if these states weren't massively indebted, right? And what they're and how leveraged they are, right? Because if there isn't a sovereign debt crisis, then states can kind of like figure this out and keep puttering along for a while. But if they are massively fragile to swings in their tax base, like I don't know how like Japan wouldn't like automatically default if like if that happened. In terms of that, like then we're in a situation where it's an interesting question of how much of that would you need to do, and then in order for it to persist, right? Once the state kind of collapsed and the central bank like is not there is no central bank, right? And you can't like kind of dole out those favors. Do those large centralized corporations that have just been hoovering up liquidity, right? Like left and right from the central bank. Like, do these things just fall apart automatically and we just have a massive amount of capital reorganization towards much more localism, much more decentralized, much smaller units of production? Or like, the techno, kind of crypto anarchist kind of utopia of you 3D print everything, and you've got like five thieves vinegar or something like that. You know what I'm talking about?
No, I don't.
Five Thieves Vinegar are the 3D is a kind of leftist anarchist group that like 3D printed like an insulin pen, like and like is very much into creating helping people create drugs in their own homes for like pharmaceuticals and stuff like that. They're pretty cool actually, from that perspective. Like just don't like follow like Lawfer for his like politics or anything like that, but like that they have like that kind of a thing, right? Like if you decentralize the means of production where things are in your own home, which is what's happening with like 3D printed guns, right? Like what are you gonna do? You're gonna try and set up a mass surveillance system in everybody's home? Well, you kind of need money to do that. Who are you gonna pay to do that? Who are you gonna pay to enforce it? It becomes a very expensive thing, and if you don't have a money to like kind of inflate to be able to pay that, I don't think you can manage it. So
right.
It ends up becoming...
Plus, when you have Bitcoin there with alongside your fiat, as Bitcoin becomes more valuable and more people start demanding it as payment, you're not going to get the cream of the crop anymore if you're paying in fiat when that's like hemorrhaging in value. Meanwhile, they can go to the private sector and get paid, possibly in Bitcoin.
Right. So the question then becomes like, like, would you be willing to get paid in dollars? And that would be like, that was kind of an interesting thing with like Spencer Dinwiddie, because like I think he tried to like, I forgot how he tried to write it into his contract to like essentially be paid in Bitcoin, or to find a way to do that, which was like a really interesting idea. But the more important thing would be like people getting paid in Bitcoin in like non-obvious ways. So like not that like publicly, I should say, because if people are doing this, if companies are seeing that like people are not like lining up to work for them or working in other places, and there's a talent drain from those corporations into kind of like new ventures, then what we're talking about is a little bit more obfuscation in like who's earning what type of money, which is a little bit more important to me, because look, if you're getting paid from the from the Brooklyn Nets, $8 million in Bitcoin or something like that. Well, the government kind of knows that you have the Bitcoin, and like, I mean, I don't know how much an athlete's going to be very like super concerned about privacy and that stuff, and that's like a UTX set that like you just follow all the way, right? You just follow it to wherever it leads you. In that regard. And that's, so like in terms of people kind of demanding things in Bitcoin, it would be really cool if essentially companies formed that could essentially take money in terms of Bitcoin and fiat. And it would actually be an interesting, like, look, I'm not endorsing any kind of not paying your taxes, people, but if you had a lifestyle where you had fiat, money that kind of allowed you to report enough fiat revenues to justify, your lifestyle and your spending and stuff like that, and you made the rest of it in Bitcoin, and you kind of like traded that, kind of in a Bitcoin space, in those kind of things. Like, could you essentially have a dual source of income where you have just enough fiat to keep, things looking okay, and just enough, and having enough Bitcoin on the side to actually, be able to dodge taxes that way in a kind of money laundering sense. Whether people would be willing to do that or not would be a really interesting thing. It'd be a really interesting thing for small businesses trying to get a leg up, right? Especially people who don't want to go the LLC route. People who want to essentially just run a business as very simply as possible. If that's their way of getting around like the taxation issue of trying to start a small business and not having to deal with like the complexities of business tax law in order to try and figure out how I can compete with Walmart or Amazon.
Yeah, it's this is what makes it so much fun, is that all these things, and there's, humans are very what's the word, crafty and like solving problems, and when you give them a tool like Bitcoin, man, it just nitrocharges that.
Yeah, and
it's going to be fun, a fun couple of years coming up with all this stuff.
Oh, it's going to be, like, that's the thing, right? Like, one of the things that's interesting from the kind of like the Catholic Twitter perspective is, there's a lot of pessimism, right? Because, there's a lot of pessimism from like, where the Catholic Church has gone, but there's a lot of, like almost feelings of inevitability that we're heading towards this globalist, New World Order, Freemasonic, and like, yes, these are all the buzzwords they will use, kind of thing. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, this is like completely the opposite, right? Like, Europe's falling apart. The United States is like, it's going to be really interesting how much localism and like federalism are going to play a role in opening up, not opening up. Right? Whether, some governors are going to be like, nah, screw you, Trump. And then some people at the local level will be like, no, screw you, governor. Right? Because everybody's like, the indebtedness of all these governments is actually going to really push some people to have to be open. Because again, the state's a parasite. Once you understand the state's a parasite, you can't kill the host. You really just can't, right? Predation always, has to come after production. And in that sense, like a state like Illinois, right, or a state like California could definitely have municipalities who, CalPERS and like, the promise, I don't know who does the Illinois pension, like investment. It's like CalPERS and CalSTRS in California. If they don't meet their goals, right, the municipalities are on the hook. Well, that means the municipalities need the tax dollars to do it. And unless the Fed, and the Fed did expand, right, their buying of like state bonds and stuff like that, and I think municipal bonds, but like the Fed doesn't, and people get this wrong all the time, right? The Fed doesn't like see how many they're issuing and just buys them all up. They just have a set amount that they buy, and that's kind of how, and they kind of buy it because they're trying to essentially obfuscate their role in the bond markets, so it doesn't look like they're buying everything as it comes out. They're just going to buy a set amount and then kind of trick people into thinking like, oh no, there's real demand for these bonds. Because the second they're like, oh no, we're just going to buy them like straight up, then it's just like, oh, okay. Then you just start issuing it like crazy and like the most ridiculous moral hazard. So there's still a lot of municipalities that just cannot afford an economic shutdown, because they have these pension obligations that will just destroy them. And we're seeing it in Europe, right? Like how the EU is going to deal with this as Italy continues to get screwed over. And it'd be really interesting to see if Salvini can get back in play in Italy in that regard. And you're seeing the rise of like nationalism everywhere, with Denmark being like the interesting one example with Mette Frederiksen of like kind of more like left, like a lefty party that's into nationalism. Alternative for Deutschland, Brexit's probably still going to happen, I hope. And then, China is like a very interesting case of, they have so much debt. I don't know how this thing stays afloat. Like, and so you're looking around and you're like, I don't see where this globalist order is coming from. It seems like everything's fracturing in the right way. Like, and then when you have, and that's the great thing about Bitcoin too, is that it's really easy to be nihilistic about the future. You can kind of look at the things that, like, that they are now. Like, look at the United States, look at all the wars, look at all the debt, look at all the, the lack of property rights. Look how unfree people are all around the world, in reality, right? Not just nominally in terms of what's on the books, but in terms of the actuality of like the potential of states to do that. There's a real easy way to just like kind of look at it and just be very nihilistic. And I don't know if you guys have ever read like The New Right.
I haven't.
Oh, it's an excellent book. It's an excellent book. And like Malice actually sets it up like Dante's Inferno, where like as you go along the book, you go deeper and deeper into. I think the last chapter is Cantwell, if I remember correctly. Both of his books are actually amazing, kind of like into descents into darkness, especially towards the end, because like Dear Reader is also.
I did read Dear Reader. Yeah, I thought that was unbelievable. It's
unbelievable, and the audio book we're reading is absolutely mesmerizing, especially that end. Yeah, it's like really easy to go down that path of darkness, right? Either be a nihilist or turn to some kind of identitarian, like some kind of false sense of like, community, like, Cantwell might, like as of like a quote unquote pragmatic thing. Well, states got to exist, so we got to win, we got to be willing to cut throats too, or something like to that effect. Not against government oppressors, but against other people. And in that regard, Bitcoin allows for you to see that there's a lot to look forward to in the next 30 years, I think, that allows people to not have such a dire view and allows them to, see something going forward. Like one of the most, like, it is kind of, and this doesn't come from like kind of, traditional Catholic, but like, like this is more from like the intersectional, like lefty types. Like I know people who are like, how I would never, bring a child into this world. And that is such a sad thought. Mm-hmm. That is such a sad thought, to think that things are so bad that you wouldn't want to bring a child into this world. And that's just like, that's no way to live. It's just no way to live. And, for someone who, regardless of their faith at this point, someone who is despairing about all that is happening right now, right? Like sometimes they just need some kind of like hope. And if Bitcoin is that hope for them, then that's like the thing that they should really be, made aware of, so that they can learn about, and like how to learn about it. And like, thankfully, unlike 2017, right, by 2020, there is so much more material for newbies on Bitcoin, right? Like Lavera's got some great episodes. McCormick's like doing an entire series on it. There are many more write-ups on it. And I think there's much more stuff out there and much more of a community that'll help protect you from, being into altcoins and things like that and not wasting your time there. And I think actually, I don't know like a website that does like very like that does like a bunch of graphics like for free. You don't have to pay for it to do this, but like I'm thinking, like, am I wrong to think that like the exchange rates between cryptos, between Bitcoin and the rest of them has gone like pretty much in Bitcoin's favor in the past few months? Like I feel like Bitcoin Cash, for example, went from like a 1-to-30 ratio to like a 1-to-36 or 1-to-35.
Yeah, they've just been on a overall downward trajectory pretty much their entire existence.
Yeah, well, to their entire existence, but like they were kind of like hovering around like 1/30, but like in like like I think 30-1, and like it was like in like the past like couple months, right, since like bouncing back from whatever it was like 4 something or whatever, like it seems like we might have a bull run. And I was always wondering when this would happen, where I think this next bull run, Bitcoin outpaces the alts. I think Bitcoin will outpace the alts, I think, in this run, because I think there is, I just don't know if there is the newness in any of these alts for people to think that there's like it's worthwhile. I think more of the attempts to scam people will be to scam people in the name of Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think that the environment's changed a lot. And back in the 2017 run-up, there was a lot of the people that were like, well, I think there could, which one's going to be the best one, or they're going to have a bunch of different things.
Yeah.
But now you have a situation where if there's another Bitcoin bull run, now this bull run's going to be probably on a different magnitude. And there's a lot of, even Ethereum in 2017 went up to like, what was it, like $1,400 or something per coin?
Yeah, something crazy. Yeah.
But that's within very similar magnitudes, with Bitcoin going up to 20,000. But this time, if Bitcoin hits 100,000 or something, there's no way that Ethereum, I mean, I don't know. They might go, but I don't think it's going to be that pull to be like, oh, well, these altcoins might be better than Bitcoin, because now it's going to be so obvious that Bitcoin is just performs so much better just on price itself, that I think that will send a much bigger signal to people to be like, well, I don't think there's going to be the pull to be like, oh, well, there will be, but people that are putting money into altcoins because they think they can get the next, they can get that 1,000x or something. Because that was the reason why people were going to that casino, because they were trying to get the next Bitcoin. But I don't think you're going to have that tendency for people to think that that's going to be the case again this time, just because, Bitcoin, even Bitcoin going to 20,000 in the 2017 run, it still was like, that's still a small, even though it's a huge number, and we were all flipping out over it. In the grand scheme of things, that's still very, very small.
Well, the other thing,
rest
though,
of the world markets.
And the other thing, though, is that, like, how many people's first hearing of Bitcoin was probably on CNBC in, like, December of 2017 or November of 2017.
Yeah, we're helping you buy Ripple there.
Yeah. But then, when it crashed, like, there are plenty of people that I'll talk to who's like, Bitcoin, that thing's still around? And I'm like, yeah. And if it pops, like, these same people, like, 2017 was not that long ago. And so, like, people remember, like, oh, I thought that thing had died, and now you're telling me that it's 100K? At that point, people have to really start reassessing their priors, because, like, it's very easy to look at the 2017 bull run and say, like, oh, okay, and then it went back down. It's like, oh, okay, tulip mania, whatever. Like you would just, like, these people had never known that, like, Bitcoin's had like 9 crashes or something like that. Tulips don't crash 9 times and bounce back.
I like that argument, because it's the same thing that so many other Bitcoiners, that's how they got into Bitcoin. It was the second or third time that they heard about it in distinctly different ways that they're like, oh, this thing's still around. I really need to look at this. It's the same thing, just people are catching on a little bit later. But it's the same kind of thought process, same kind of method that or not method, but same kind of way that you end up really starting to pay attention.
Yeah,
so I think that's a very good argument, because you're not making a new argument for why people would be drawn to it.
Right, and for you guys playing, Bitcoin maximalist bingo at home, I'm just going to bring up Nassim Taleb. So, good for whoever won on that one tonight. You get like 1 Satoshi. So
he's paying, not us. Go after.
So, what ends up happening is, I think that everyone, unless they have neomania, is a believer in the Lindy effect in practice. The problem is for an idea is only as Lindy as you've been aware of it, right? If you an idea in your head is only going to be as Lindy as you're going to be aware of it, unless you believe the other practitioners of that idea, right? So your own experience is going to dictate the Lindy effect of something. So someone who has been following Bitcoin for 10 years is going to view Bitcoin as much more Lindy than someone whose first exposure to Bitcoin was like 2017 and decided to never look at it again.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah, that I think is a great way to kind of like look at the that idea of, oh no, it's the second bull run or your third bull run, right? Because that doesn't mean that everyone's going to be prepared for, like, if this goes 500K and then crashes down to 100K, like, do they sell their bags? I don't know if there's anything, unless you're like a freak like me who's just like, all right, whatever. It's gone down from 20 to like 5. I'm still in it for forever. Unless you're unless you're like absolutely ideologically driven, which that's another actually interesting example for the Catholic Church and like the corporate press. But that's an analogy for a later date. If you're not ideologically driven, then yeah, you look at it and you're like, oh my gosh, this thing's crashing. Is it going to go to zero? That's going to be an interesting thing for people to feel like in terms of like holding on in that respect. But at that point, like once you've seen it kind of rise up the second time, now you're like, okay, this thing might be for real. And then the other problem is in terms of like the volatility aspect is how many people will switch their mindset from this is something I buy to trade versus buy to hold. And how many of these people are like, because I'm buying to trade, how many of these people won't buy it levered? Because like that's the ultimate thing, right? If you're talking about, strong hands, weak hands, leverage and the desire to try to be Tone Vays or something like that, like those are the things that'll kill you.
Yes, it will. As we see in the traditional markets right now with how over leveraged everyone is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but they get bailed out.
Yeah,
potentially.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah, for now.
Like the bond market has been like the easiest trade for like 30 years. Like I have a friend in finance and he absolutely hates, like he works in a family office and he absolutely hates the bond guy because the bond guy is so just full of himself about how much money he can make. And it's like, look, I get it. Like I'd hate that guy too because like this guy just has a central bank that's just like, yeah, sure, let's increase bond prices.
That was actually like this was years ago. I used to work at an oil refinery, and we met a bunch of like the crude traders that worked in the corporate office, and the one dude was just the most arrogant dude in the world. Yeah, I just made the company $10 million today with a couple trades I made. I know I can empathize with your friend a little bit.
Yeah, definitely.
So
he's one I've tried to get into Bitcoin, but he's like, it's just too hard. It's too hard. Can you do it for me? I'm like, nah, dude, I'm not willing to hold like that much. I'm not willing to hold that much Bitcoin for you, and then have it go wrong. Like you got to hold this stuff yourself.
And that's part of the journey too. You have to have that the cold sweat and the hot feeling on the back of your neck when you're did I type that address right? Yeah. That's part of
why isn't it coming up on my note? Why isn't this transaction going through?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. and then when it works, it's
like magic.
It's
the greatest thing.
It's incredible. And that's why that's a good point that you don't want to like necessarily do stuff for other people. One, because it's like, you want them to kind of learn it and understand everything that needs to be done. But at the same time, you don't want to rob that emotional roller coaster that ends very, very well for them. And it's an experience to just be like, man, without trusting a bank or any third party, I just moved I moved money. I moved my wealth and I can send it wherever I want and no one's stopping me.
Yeah, unfortunately though, right? Like, I'm getting back to like the consequences of inflation because you have to work so long, so hard just to maintain a living, going forward in time, right? That it eats up a lot of people's time for this kind of self-improvement.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep.
And that's the tricky thing. So like I can understand like someone's desire to hold, some sats for someone thinking that like, oh, maybe they'll learn about this like later and then I can like, hand over custody. I don't know who it was who was like talking about maybe the idea of like a time locked Bitcoin gift, or something like that.
Well, they have that for kind of like givebitcoin.com.
Yeah.
Something similar there. And I'm kind of I buy Bitcoin for my nephews for their birthdays.
I think the problem with a gift is there's no skin in the game with a gift.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, my nephews are the only ones that I will give Bitcoin to because they're 4, 6, and 8, and
right,
you know,
and that's a different thing altogether.
Yes,
right.
exactly.
They're not adults, right? Like with respect to adults, like giving them a gift means that like they just like if you throw away a gift, oh whatever, and like
if
I don't think that's worth risking.
No, because and it would just build up resentment if it's like, oh yeah, remember that Bitcoin I sent you that would be worth, you know, $40,000 right now? Oh yeah, I threw that away. I don't know what happened to it. Like, it's just not probably not a good situation.
It's just like not worth the aggravation, right? Like at some point you can be like the best thing to do is try to, and like I try to do this, you know, with more of the kind of like the anarchist, like and libertarian, like Austrian kind of stuff is like when you read through, like kind of just bookmark in your head, like, oh, like if I want to give someone like a short read on where my position is, like, okay, like it used to be like, okay, I'll give them Anatomy of the State. And then you're like, all right, can I find an article that's like even shorter? And it's just like, oh yeah, Rothbardian Ethics. All right, that'll work. And then like, you know, even like, like I said, like, you know, oh, can I find something even shorter to get them to like see the fundamental question? And I'm like, oh yeah, like, you know, Kuzan's like, do we ever escape anarchy? And it's like, you kind of keep doing that. And like, it'd be really nice to kind of cultivate, like, if someone like would just cultivate kind of like a good kind of like Bitcoiner's guide for like beginners, not only in terms of like level, but in terms of just like time investment to read. So like if I wanted to get someone to understand like how to buy Bitcoin on like BISC or like a decentralized exchange, or if they wanted to buy it on exchange, how to like coin join and things like that, you can have like levels with respect to that, but also like just the amount of time, because sometimes to explain something simply takes a lot of words and nobody's going to want to read like a 20-30 minute Medium post. It's just not going to really fly. You're going to like lose someone really quick.
Well, what you do is just grab them by the shoulders and yell, "Number go up."
Well, so I mean, like ultimately that's what's going to happen, right? Like ultimately it's going to be, I don't think it's going to be number go up as much as dollar like or like fiat go down.
Yeah.
Like it's going to be the pain of the opportunity cost, particularly when they see the dollars go down. So this is where I think I disagree with people. So like I had a talk with my cousin's kid who I've converted a grand total of like maybe 3 people to Bitcoin and anarcho-capitalism.
Nice.
So not the greatest list there. I'm no Tom Woods, but like he was asking me like, you know, well, what's the difference between, you know, what would be the difference if they went to like, you know, nominal negative interest rates? And I said that at that point, you're seeing the fact that like potentially that if I put my money in the bank, it's actually going down. And there's no one to blame but the fact that like, oh, I'm putting my money in the bank and it's going down. Whereas if you have negative real interest rates, you could still see your bank account be flat. The prices around you go up, and you can blame the prices on a million different things.
Right.
Inflation it obfuscates is you know, you're obvious. It's very difficult to tell if you don't have an underlying economic understanding. But it's very easy to see in a world of negative interest rates, real interest rates, where it's just like, oh, if I put my money in the bank, they're charging me, which is actually like what a bank should be doing in a real like full reserve system, right? More likely is charging a fee for like, you know, custodianship essentially. But if they see that, then it's just like, well, why wouldn't I keep my money like with me? And like, obviously this is like going to be compounded by the fact that like, look, if you live in like, you know, certain areas of the country, you may not want to, you know, walk around with $1,700 after you cashed your check for like, you know, like your last 2 weeks of work or 3 weeks of work or a month of work or whatever. But there's going to become more and more of a pain of holding your money in a system that is actively just taking money away from you, and you can see it every single day in your balance. And that's a big difference, a way bigger difference, I think, than, you know, real negative interest rates. And it'd be interesting to see, like, if a bank ever did do that, like what that would look like, in terms of people trying to keep their money under a mattress, because you would set yourself up for like a massive deflation, which is why I don't know. Like, it'll be an interesting thing to see what happens if these central banks try to cross, like, other than Japan, because Japanese people are weird. Japanese people decide, like, we're going to keep buying Japanese bonds. We'll just work until we're 80, or we're going to, like, have our suicide rates, like, for young men, like, go through the roof. And in that case, like, it's going to be very interesting to see how people react to that if they're willing to keep their money in that system. Because if you don't keep your money in the bank, essentially you do have these kind of bank runs, or you lose liquidity in the bank, you lose that private money creation, and the government's going to have to like figure out a way to print that back into existence. But if the banks don't have ability to loan those reserves, like what's the point? Like, and that's where you get into this like kind of like the idea of this deflationary kind of move to Bitcoin that like like Saifedean would talk about. At least I don't know where he is like currently on that, but like that was his thing, right? Like last year is like, it's not going to be like the hyperinflationary kind of like Bitcoin transition thing that a lot of people think it is. It's actually going to be more of a deflation as the demand for dollars goes down. It's actually the loans, right? The private money creation falters. My only like problem with that argument is that like I think the central banks would step in to try and print, because like the governments would be insolvent. So I think there would be a deflation. It'd be interesting to see how long it would go. But then like the central banks would have to print unless the central banks capitulated. And if the central banks capitulated, that would be amazing. Like I don't know what the heck that looks like. But yeah, like it's gonna be really interesting to see how the next, to be honest, the next like couple years goes, because what the treasury, like the other thing that like people don't recognize is that like at least the United States I'm aware of, they're so front loaded in their debt, and let me explain. So remember, there's like $23 trillion of debt, but you have to keep rolling over that debt, right? So it's not like oh, there's $23 trillion of debt and you just have to pay the interest payments on it. It's like, no, there are bonds that like expire and you have to pay the principal on, right, and you have to roll those over by buying new bonds. Mm-hmm. So a lot of that's really front loaded into like the near term. I think like Luke Groman, if you follow Luke Groman on Twitter, like at least for a while was tweeting out kind of like that kind of cascade of debt, like how much of it is actually pretty like recently short term, how much the United States has to kind of roll over the next couple years. That there's really not much room for, like, essentially they're very fragile to the interest rate, kind of ticking up on them. Now, granted, like, the United States has the petrodollar and all that stuff, unlike other countries, but that's like the interesting question is like, who are they selling these treasuries to? And at some point it has to become a fact that like, it has to become so rather apparent that the only person in the market for US treasuries is like the US central bank. Like, it's going to be like, like, what was it? Like, for a while, like, for the ECB was, like, the only buyer of Italian bonds. Like, the only one, pretty much. And you would just make it so that, like, what? Like, the Fed would just tell a private investor, like, oh, here, you just buy the bond for, like, a day, and then we'll take it off your books. To try and, like, hide that. But if that becomes, like, common knowledge and that's what they're doing, then, like what faith can you even have in the US dollar at that point? Like, it becomes very much, I think, open season in terms of people trying to get the heck out from a global perspective. Maybe not from a US domestic perspective, but from a global perspective, it makes one very concerned about that. So we are set. It's like I said, I thought 2050, and like this has really accelerated the timetable. And like, I just hope that Bitcoin is kind of like ready from like an on-ramps perspective, like Lightning perspective, et cetera, because it would be a little bit weird to like essentially see Bitcoin kind of like have this huge rush and then kind of stall out, because essentially it's not ready for prime time just yet. And I remember talking to Bitcoin Tina about this in Dallas during the last BitBlock Boom conference, and he was just like very adamant that like the Fed needs to keep printing needs to be doing, because like, he's Austrian, like us, but he's just very much more like this needs to be a very easy transition. And that means that the governments need to do what they can to keep this thing rolling as much as they possibly can. That's why, he was tweeting out before, like, the coronavirus thing, like, a bunch of, like, the Fed needs to do more, it's not doing enough, blah, blah, blah. And, like, that doesn't make sense unless you're coming at it from his perspective of Bitcoin's going to win. That's inevitable. Like, there's no one, if you want to get someone pumped about, like, Bitcoin going in the future, just have them listen to, like, one of Bitcoin Tina's, like, things on, like Tales from the Crypt or something like that. That'll get you pumped. But that we need to kind of at least give ourselves some runway for Bitcoin to actually be able to have the infrastructure to be able to take on all these people. And that's, like, the only fear about, like, the accelerated timetable is that, like, is it a little bit too soon where it's not as smooth and therefore there's just, like, a little bit or potentially more suffering than when we would like in this kind of transition. Right. But I think we all can kind of see, like, it's almost as inevitable almost as, like, Christ's second coming.
Yeah. I mean, it's when you start digging into monetary economics and you see that that's what people do. I mean, it's until something, and that's the beauty of it. Bitcoin either gets broken. Bitcoin fails when it either gets broken, which doesn't seem that likely, or something better comes along. And if something better comes along, then that's great.
The only other alternative...
We welcome Bitcoin's failure.
The only other alternative would be, and I think this is also... I don't know if someone other than Safedean's made this argument, is if for somehow... And again, the problem with this is, like, there's way too much... These governments are way too levered up for, I think, for this to happen, especially a country like England who doesn't have gold, is if countries went back to a gold standard.
Yeah, I think that it just kicks the can down the road.
Correct. You're kicking the can down the road, but essentially you're trying to do a reset, and you're essentially trying to kick the can down the road for another 70 years.
Right.
So then, like, does Bitcoin kind of, like, loom ominously around, like, keeping nations on a gold standard? Then, like, if that's the case, then Bitcoin's kind of won anyway.
Right.
From that perspective, it hasn't won as big as we wanted it to in terms of crushing the nation state and crushing, all states. I think actually that might be enough to crush a nation state, to be honest. Because if you look at, like, any nation trying to go to war, the first thing that you do is you debase your currency. And if you debase your currency and we can just kind of run into Bitcoin, then, like, okay. I think, like, we might just go back down to, like, city-state level. But in the grand scheme of things, like, if that's the best we can get, I'll gladly take that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we're not here for. We'll hopefully see perfection if we are so fortunate to make it to heaven.
Yeah, but that's pretty much it, right? Like, that's pretty much the thing, right? Like, you can't like, this world is important in that, but ultimately you do have to have, way more attention on what's above than what's down here.
Right. Yep. So on that note, why don't you tell people where they can find you to come talk to you?
Yeah. So, I mean, Twitter, 0, like the number, knowledge actor. And no, the name is not actually because, like, I'm really into zero knowledge proofs, but it was actually because I think Nassim Taleb on an episode of Econ Talk once mentioned the idea of a zero knowledge system where, as long as you have the right, essentially, skin in the game, like, you run the simulation in this paper and, like, the economic allocation of resources is actually pretty decent. So, like, oh, so you don't even need knowledge in the system, which is essentially, right, like, a backwards way of saying, like, as long as you have prices in private property and you can do economic calculation, you'll be good. If you can't do that, you're kind of screwed.
Yep. Yeah.
So
that's
a Misesian argument, if ever there was one.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah. So that'll be in the show notes page, mcflugel.com/tractor. I mean, McFlugel.com/197.
I was going to call you out on that.
No, don't worry. That's the only note I ever write for the most part in my notebook for these episodes.
Well, look, ultimately what happens when we all have our Bitcoin citadels is no more tractors, no more monocropping. We just have grazing lands and like all the beef and lamb that we can eat, all the ruminants. We all go carnivore at that point.
Tractors are multi-purpose, so we don't have to use them for plowing. There's other things.
Well, see, that shows you, look.
You can use a tractor to pull your horses.
Yeah, look, we'll have horses, we'll have cows that can plow the field if need be, but ultimately we need to restore to borrow the line from Bitstein, right? We got to restore the American prairie, and all the bison that should be there.
Yeah.
So no more tractors.
No more tractors.
No,
just nature.
We'll use them as tractors. Will be used as pets. We'll domesticate them.
There we go.
See.
There we go.
I'll dig my heels deeper on this than I will than Bitcoin. So, all right. Everyone go check out, go follow Zero Knowledge Actor. It'll be on the show notes page, mcflugel.com/197 while you're there. Might as well go buy a Liberty mug. Also, we got the Telegram group open for anyone that wants to come in and chat. Not necessarily about libertarianism. Mostly about what we're cooking and what we're drinking, but obviously conversation about Bitcoin and libertarianism happens a lot there too. And best thing you could do for us too is to share this podcast out with friends and family and people who think might appreciate it and listen to it. That's we always appreciate that. And thanks for listening. We will catch you next week.
Peace.